At 11:47 p.m., on a bitter March night in 1944, a young Norwegian prisoner crouched low in frozen mud, his breath barely visible in the darkness. His name was Erik Anderson, and hidden inside his memory was a skill the occupying forces had already dismissed as meaningless folklore. 3 weeks earlier, when he was captured, the guards had laughed while confiscating the old hand-forged axe wrapped in his pack. They treated it like a museum joke, hanging it on an office wall as a decorative relic. What they did not know was that within the next hour, that same axe would turn their certainty into silence. Erik had grown up in Rjukan, a factory town shaped by aluminum plants and long winters. His father worked the mills, but his grandfather, Gunnar Anderson, lived by fire and iron. Gunnar was a traditional blacksmith, one of the last men in Norway still shaping tools by hand. Every summer from the age of 8, Erik stood inside that forge, learning patience, balance, and control. The old man did not teach him violence. He taught him precision. Erik threw axes, not for sport, but as discipline. Distance mattered, wind mattered, rotation mattered. By 16, Erik could hit a narrow target from 40 feet with near-perfect consistency, not by strength, but by understanding, timing, and release. When Germany invaded Norway in 1940, Erik was 19. He watched soldiers march through his streets and factories, turned into assets for the Reich. He joined the resistance quietly, first as a courier, later moving weapons and guiding escaped pilots toward Sweden. In February 1944, someone betrayed them. Erik was arrested during a failed drop and sent north to Grini detention camp, along with 11 others, including his childhood friend Lars. Grini was not an extermination camp, but death still came often through cold, illness, or execution. Inside the camp, Erik stayed silent and watched. Guards rotated predictably. Searchlights followed habits, not logic. Cigarettes were smoked in the same places at the same times. Most importantly, Erik noticed a blind stretch of darkness near the administrative building, invisible to the northwest tower during shift changes. It was small, but it existed, and in places like Grini, even a small gap could mean survival. Then the whisper started. 17 prisoners were marked for execution at dawn on March 15th for sabotage tied to the heavy water program. Erik's name was on the list. So was Lars. Escape had failed before, always ending with public deaths meant to crush hope. But Erik saw something different. He still remembered the balance of that axe hanging on the wall upstairs. Late on March 13th, he told a handful of men his plan. It sounded impossible. One weapon, multiple armed guards, no alarms, but impossible was better than waiting for a truck at sunrise. And as the camp settled into uneasy sleep, Erik made his choice. Either the axe returned to his hands, or none of them would see another morning. And the night had not even begun yet. The camp clock ticked past midnight as Erik lay still on his wooden bunk, counting breaths instead of seconds. Around him, men pretended to sleep, while fear moved quietly between them like a draft through cracked walls. Guards changed shifts at exactly 12:10 a.m. every night. Not because it was smart, but because routine made them feel untouchable. Erik waited for that moment. He had memorized the sound of boots on gravel, the pause for jokes, the brief overlap when no one was fully watching. At 12:11, he slid off the bunk and pressed himself against the wall. Lars followed, then 3 others. They moved without speaking, each man already accepting that this would either end in freedom or death. The first obstacle was the corridor outside the barracks. A single guard leaned against the far wall, half awake, rifle hanging loose, attention drifting toward a cigarette he was trying to shield from the wind. Erik did not rush. His grandfather's voice lived in his head, calm and steady. Speed is nothing without control. Erik reached the office door and slipped inside. The axe still hung there, just where he remembered it, mounted like a trophy above a desk cluttered with papers and maps. He lifted it carefully, feeling the familiar weight settle into his palm. It was not heavy. It was balanced. That mattered more than anything. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes. The forge, the heat, the sound of iron singing under the hammer. Then he turned. The first throw was not dramatic. It was efficient. The axe left Eric's hand, rotated once, and struck the guard at the base of the skull. He collapsed without a sound. Lars caught the body before it hit the floor. No alarm, no shout, just silence. They moved fast after that. 2 more guards stood near the radio room. Eric did not aim to kill both. He only needed confusion. The axe flew again, striking the wooden doorframe inches from a guard's face. He flinched, shouted, and turned just as Lars tackled him. The second guard reached for the alarm, but another prisoner was already there, slamming him into the wall. Chaos, but controlled chaos. Eric retrieved the axe and ran. The blind stretch of darkness he had studied for weeks opened in front of them like a door no one believed existed. Searchlights swept the yard, missing them by seconds. Shots rang out, wild and panicked, but no one aimed properly. The prisoners scattered exactly as planned, not together, not apart, just enough to confuse pursuit. Eric reached the fence first. Someone cut the wire. Someone screamed. Someone fell. Eric did not look back. He ran until his lungs burned and the forest swallowed him whole. Behind him, Greeny Camp erupted in alarms and gunfire. Ahead of him, only black trees and uncertainty waited, but the night still had one final test left to give. The forest was not welcoming. It never was. Snow clung to the lower branches like silent witnesses, and every step threatened to betray them with a sharp crack or a slide into frozen ground. Eric slowed his pace, not out of exhaustion, but discipline. Panic made noise. Noise invited death. He listened instead. Shouting echoed behind them, followed by dogs released too early, their handlers impatient and angry rather than precise. That mistake mattered. Eric had learned these woods as a boy, following his grandfather on long winter walks, where survival was taught without drama. Read the ground. Respect the wind. Never move like you are being chased, even when you are. He guided the others uphill, away from the obvious paths, toward rockier terrain that confused scent trails and punished heavy boots. Within minutes, the shouts faded into distant frustration. By 2 a.m., only 6 of them remained together. The others had split as planned, each carrying different risks. Lars was still beside him, bleeding lightly from a cut above the eye, but moving strong. No one spoke. They didn't need to. Each man understood the rule now. Stop thinking about escape. Start thinking about endurance. At a shallow ravine, Eric signaled them to halt. He snapped a pine branch and dragged it carefully across their tracks, then poured a small amount of alcohol from a stolen flask onto the snow. Dogs followed scent. Alcohol disrupted it just enough to buy time. Another lesson from Gunnar, originally meant for hunting deer, now repurposed for survival against men. They rested for 6 minutes. Not more. Resting too long invited mistakes. Eric checked the axe. One blade edge was chipped from striking stone during the run. It didn't matter. An axe didn't need perfection. It needed intention. Just before dawn, the sound of engines reached them. Trucks. The Germans were sealing roads, assuming the escapees would flee toward Sweden immediately. Eric smiled thinly. That assumption would kill more than it saved. Instead of heading east, he led the group south, deeper into terrain few patrols bothered with. Swamps slept beneath the snow there, treacherous but quiet. By midday, hunger set in. Fear turned inward, becoming doubt. One man whispered that they should surrender. Another argued they would never make it. Eric said nothing until they reached a clearing where the sun hit the snow just right. Then he spoke once. They think we are running, he said. We are not. We are disappearing. That changed something. Not hope, but focus. As the light faded again, Eric spotted smoke in the distance. Not German. Too careless. A hunting cabin. A chance. Or a trap. Eric tightened his grip on the axe and stepped forward first. Because survival does not reward hesitation. The cabin looked abandoned at first glance, slouched under the weight of snow and time. Its chimney exhaled a thin, lazy ribbon of smoke that did not match military discipline. German patrol fires were controlled, hidden, efficient. This was not that. Eric raised his fist, and the group froze instantly. Every man dropped low, blending into the white and shadow like scars in the landscape. Eric circled wide, slow and patient, the axe held low against his thigh. He did not approach the door. Doors were for fools and the desperate. He crept to the side window instead, brushing frost aside just enough to see inside. An old man sat at a rough table, hands shaking slightly as he poured something dark into a tin cup. Alone. No radio. No rifle in reach. Norwegian. Eric knocked once, hard, then stepped back. The door opened a crack. The old man's eyes widened when he saw the faces outside, hollowed by cold and hunted by fear. He did not ask questions. He did not need to. He opened the door fully and waved them in without a word. Inside, heat wrapped around them like a forgotten memory. The smell of wood smoke and boiled potatoes hit harder than any meal. The old man locked the door, pulled the curtains tight, and finally spoke. "You have 20 minutes, he said quietly. "After that, they will search here." No one argued. They ate fast, not enough to be full, just enough to think clearly again. Lars cleaned his cut. Another man warmed his hands until the shaking stopped. Eric stood near the window, watching the tree line. He trusted the man who helped them, but trust did not replace caution. True to the warning, engines growled in the distance before the 20 minutes ended. German voices followed, sharp and impatient. The old man opened a trapdoor near the hearth and pointed down. A root cellar. Narrow, dark. Safe enough. Eric was last to descend. As he pulled the hatch closed, boots stomped onto the porch above them. Voices argued. Someone demanded entry. The old man answered calmly, slow, irritated, playing the role perfectly. The search lasted less than 5 minutes. Soldiers were tired, cold, convinced the escapees were already far away when the trucks finally left. Silence returned, heavy and thick. They waited another hour before moving again. The old man gave them a rough map scratched on paper, marking old Sami routes that patrols rarely used. Before Eric left, the man glanced at the axe and nodded once. No words, just understanding. Night fell again as they pushed onward. Fewer men now. 2 had turned back earlier, choosing surrender over uncertainty. Eric did not judge them. Survival was not moral. It was personal. By the 3rd night, Lars collapsed. His wound had worsened. Infection crept quietly, just like fear. Eric carried him until his legs failed, then carried him again. Dawn found them near the border region, but borders did not mean safety. They meant last chances. And somewhere ahead, the hardest decision of Eric's life waited quietly in the snow. The border was not a line. It never was. It was a rumor drawn across mountains, forests, and human fear. Eric knew that better than most. As dawn bled slowly into the sky, the land ahead looked no different than the land behind. Yet everything depended on choosing the right path through it. Lars lay against a tree, skin pale, breath shallow. Infection had taken its grip, turning time into an enemy far more dangerous than any patrol. Eric knelt beside him, pressing snow into a cloth to cool the fever. Lars tried to smile and failed. "You should go," he whispered. "Not bravado, not surrender, just clarity." Eric shook his head once. That was all. The map the old man had given them showed a narrow pass used by smugglers decades earlier, a place where sound carried strangely and footsteps vanished into stone. The problem was distance. Lars could not walk that far. Carrying him would slow Erik enough to invite patrols, sweeping the area by daylight. By midday, the sound of dogs returned, closer this time. Not rushed, not panicked. Professionals. Erik listened carefully, separating echoes from intent. He had minutes, not hours. This was the moment every escape story avoided. The part where courage was not loud, but heavy. Lars grabbed Erik's sleeve. "If they catch us together," he said, voice breaking, "everything ends here." Erik stood slowly, axe in hand. His grandfather's lessons returned, not about throwing, but about knowing when a tool had reached its final purpose. The axe was survival, yes, but survival was not only movement. Sometimes it was distraction. Sometimes it was delay. Erik made his choice. He dragged branches across one trail, then another, creating the illusion of movement toward the east. He tore cloth from his own sleeve and tied it to a low branch, letting it flutter like a careless mistake. Then he turned south alone, running hard, deliberately snapping branches, letting sound travel. He wanted to be followed. The dogs took the bait. Erik ran until his lungs screamed and his legs trembled. Shots cracked through the trees, close enough to bite the air. He did not look back. He counted terrain instead, measuring distance, waiting for the slope he remembered from the map. When he reached it, he turned suddenly and vanished into stone, pressing himself into a narrow cut between rocks, just wide enough to breathe. The patrol passed within meters of him. Boots, voices, frustration. Hours later, when silence finally returned, Erik crossed the border alone. He never learned exactly how Lars' story ended, only that weeks later, resistance networks spoke of a wounded man who survived by hiding in plain sight, carried by strangers who never learned his name. Erik would never throw the axe again. He buried it near the border, blade down, handle pointing toward home, and even decades later, when people told stories of daring escapes, they never spoke of the quiet choice that made them possible. But that choice was the reason the story did not end there. Erik did not celebrate crossing the border. There were no raised fists, no tears of relief, no dramatic collapse into safety. Freedom arrived quietly, like a door closing behind him without a sound. On the Swedish side, the forest felt the same, yet everything had shifted. Patrols were gone. Dogs were gone. The air itself felt less hunted. But relief did not erase what he had left behind. He was found 2 days later by local contacts linked to the resistance. Thin, exhausted, and nearly unrecognizable. They fed him, warmed him, and asked questions. He answered only halfway. Some details were meant to stay buried. Names, routes, choices. Survival depended on silence as much as action. Weeks later, Erik learned the truth about Greenie. The executions went ahead, but fewer names were called than expected. Confusion from the escape had delayed the process. Records were lost, orders contradicted each other. Lars' name appeared on a list of missing prisoners, not executed. That was all Erik ever learned, and it was enough. Hope did not need proof. It only needed possibility. Erik never returned to open combat. Instead, he trained others, couriers, saboteurs, messengers who would never carry rifles, only information. He taught them how to move without urgency, how to read patterns instead of reacting to fear. Sometimes, late at night, someone would ask about the axe. Erik would simply say it was a tool, nothing more. After the war, he went back to Rjukan. The forge still stood, quiet and dusty, but intact. Erik cleaned it, lit the fire, and worked iron again, not for weapons, but for hinges, plows, and simple tools. Objects meant to hold things together, not tear them apart. The past stayed with him, but it did not rule him. Years later, a young man once asked him if the story was true, if he had really escaped the camp with nothing but an old axe and luck. Eric smiled faintly and shook his head. "Not luck," he said. "Attention. History rarely remembers attention. It prefers explosions, numbers, and names carved into stone. But sometimes, history turns on quieter things. A habit noticed, a shadow memorized, a decision made when no one is watching. Somewhere near a forgotten border, an axe still rests beneath the snow, rusted now, returning slowly to the earth. It does not mark a victory or a defeat. It marks a moment when survival chose patience over noise. And that is where this story ends. If this story held your attention, do not let it end here. Subscribe now for more untold wartime stories where survival depended on intelligence, discipline, and human choice rather than luck. Like the video if you value stories that reveal what history often leaves in the shadows, and share it with someone who believes courage is not always loud. Stay with this channel, because the next story may change the way you see history forever.